This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and more dangerous. It's about what happens when the most neutral tools of a democracy stop being neutral. When money, timing, permission, begin to move not by law, not by need, but by loyalty. You don't see it all at once. You feel it in fragments. A delay here, a freeze there, a decision that suddenly depends on where you live or who you voted for. Nothing collapses. Nothing explodes. The system keeps running, and that's the problem. Because when governance turns conditional, when support becomes selective, the danger isn't chaos, it's normalization. If you want to understand how that shift happens, quietly, legally argued, repeatedly blocked, but never abandoned, stay with me. Because this story isn't about whether the system breaks. It's about what it becomes instead. And to see that, we have to stop looking at people and start looking at control. Right now, the system is not being driven by law breaking in secret. It's being driven by leverage in plain sight. What actually controls the machinery is not ideology, it's dependency. Federal money doesn't just fund projects. It sets rhythms, timelines, expectations. And when those rhythms are disrupted selectively, the disruption itself becomes power. The executive doesn't need to rewrite statutes to change outcomes. It only needs to decide when money moves, where it stalls, who waits. That's the quiet shift. Control migrates from Congress's words on paper to the executive's hand on the valve. Courts step in again and again, blocking this cut, reversing that freeze. But notice what's already changed. The fight is no longer over policy. It's over access. And every time the system has to be rescued by injunction, the baseline moves. What once would have been unthinkable becomes routine. That's not gridlock. That's a new operating environment. And once you see that, the next move becomes easier to predict. There was a time when federal support was boring. It moved slowly, predictably, through formulas, through committees, through laws that were intentionally dull. Before, a state didn't wonder why money arrived. It only checked whether it qualified. That's the difference. Before was eligibility. Now is alignment. The change didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived with questions, with pauses, with sudden reviews that had no clock. Before, a grant was an outcome. Now, it's a relationship. And that's the silent shift. Because once funding becomes conditional in practice, even if it's illegal in theory, the burden flips. States have to prove loyalty instead of compliance. Institutions have to calculate risk instead of following rules. Nothing in the statute books changes. Everything in behavior does. Courts can reverse decisions. They cannot reverse hesitation. And hesitation spreads faster than policy. That's why this isn't loud. It's procedural. It hides in the gap between what the law says and how long you're willing to wait. And that gap is about to matter. Then it stopped being abstract. A line was crossed where the motive became visible: federal energy funding, allocated by Congress, approved through normal channels. Suddenly, it was divided, not by need, not by infrastructure readiness, by how states voted. Blue states were told their funding would be cut. Red states were not. No new law, no new authority claimed, just a decision, and that's when the court stepped in. A federal judge blocked it, called it illegal, not controversial. Illegal. Not because energy policy was debated, but because punishment was. The same thing happened again. A major offshore wind project, already approved, already underway, serving 2 states, ordered shut down, not for safety, not for compliance, for signaling, blocked again. Here's the mistake people make. They think these rulings mean the system worked. But the ruling isn't the story. The attempt is, because once an administration tries to sort states into winners and losers, the warning has already been sent, even when it fails, especially when it fails and the next attempt doesn't look the same. What looks like chaos is actually a system learning. Here's the hidden mechanism. The executive doesn't need to win in court to win in practice. It only needs to force everyone else to move slower. Every freeze triggers a lawsuit. Every lawsuit triggers uncertainty. Every uncertainty shifts behavior before a judge ever rules. Who benefits? The branch that can act instantly. Who absorbs the damage? States waiting on funds, organizations burning reserves, families who don't know why services stalled. Even when the court restores the money, the cost is already paid. Time is lost. Plans are broken. Trust erodes. This is how punishment works without permanence. It doesn't have to last. It just has to interrupt. And interruption becomes a policy tool. The judiciary can say no. Congress can object, but neither can give back the weeks, the months, the hesitation that spreads through institutions deciding whether speaking up is worth the delay. That's the mechanism, not control by law, control by friction. And once friction is weaponized, the next escalation doesn't target states. It targets voices. Then it moved closer, not to governments, to institutions that speak, a medical association, professional, non partisan, funded through federal grants already awarded. They criticized federal health policy publicly, as experts do, and the money disappeared. Not after a review, not after an audit, after criticism. Grants canceled, programs frozen, no allegation of misconduct, just retaliation. A judge stepped in, called it what it was. Illegal, ordered the funding restored. Again, people point to the ending. They miss the damage. Because while the court was deciding, the signal traveled faster than the ruling. Speak, and you may lose funding. Question, and you may stall your own work. You don't need mass censorship when hesitation does the job for you. This wasn't about medicine. It was about discipline, and it revealed something new. The system wasn't just sorting states. It was testing whether speech itself could be priced, whether expertise could be conditioned, whether dissent could be made expensive. The court said no. But the question had already been asked. And once that question exists, it doesn't stay contained, because the next target isn't a grant. It's the rules that decide who gets to vote. Faster now, because this part doesn't linger. Election money, federal funds, already appropriated. States were told, change your rules or lose the money. Not suggested, conditioned. The logic was blunt. Compliance in exchange for funding. A federal judge stopped it immediately. No ambiguity. No balancing test. The Constitution gives the president no authority over election administration. None. Not indirect. Not conditional. None. That ruling matters because it exposes intent. This wasn't about efficiency. It wasn't about fraud. It was about leverage. If you can't rewrite election law, you squeeze it. If you can't command states, you starve them. Except this time, the court didn't just block the move, it drew a hard boundary. And boundaries change behavior because now everyone knows where the line is. And more importantly, how often it's being tested. At this point, the pattern is unmistakable. Funding, speech, elections, different targets, same mechanism. And the pace is increasing because once one lever fails, you don't stop. You pull another. This is where it reaches you, not as a concept, as a delay, as a letter that doesn't come, as a program that suddenly pauses with no explanation. Childcare funding frozen, social services stalled, money meant for families rerouted into a fight they didn't choose. This isn't abstract federalism. This is rent. This is hours at work. This is whether help arrives before a crisis becomes permanent. Because when funds for needy families are used as leverage, the pain doesn't land on governors. It lands on households. You don't get a press release explaining why support stopped. You just feel the gap. Courts step in. Again. They block the freeze. Again. But here's what the ruling can't undo. The weeks of uncertainty, the programs that shut their doors early, the quiet calculation, don't speak, don't attract attention. If you're still watching, it's because you recognize this pattern, because you've lived inside a system where silence feels safer than delay. And that's the point. Because once harm becomes indirect, it becomes easier to deny. And once it's normalized, it doesn't stay domestic. Zoom out, because this doesn't stop at state lines. When federal systems turn conditional, other governments notice. Allies watch how money moves. Markets watch how rules bend. Institutions abroad learn what kind of commitments actually hold. Energy projects stalled here ripple outward. Supply chains adjust. Investments hesitate. Partnerships recalculate risk. Scientific funding signals matter globally. When research budgets become unstable, talent moves. Data gaps widen, forecasts degrade, and election interference, blocked or not, travels fastest. Because once a democracy tests the idea that voting rules can be pressured by money, that idea doesn't stay local. It becomes a precedent or a warning. Either way, it spreads. The system starts speaking two languages at once. One legal, one practical. Officially, the rules are intact. Functionally, everyone is bracing. That's how credibility erodes. Not with a collapse, with uncertainty that never quite resolves. And the more often institutions have to be saved by courts, the less confidence remains that the system can run without emergency intervention, which brings us to what happens next. Because systems under constant strain don't just resist, they accelerate. Now we reach the future, not a prediction. A fork. There are three paths from here. The first is adjustment. Institutions harden. Courts intervene faster. Congress reasserts itself more often. The system survives by learning to expect abuse and counter it reflexively. The second is erosion. Nothing breaks outright, but friction becomes permanent. Delays become normal. Compliance becomes cautious. The law exists, but only after litigation. And then there is rupture. That's the path where one branch decides the blocks no longer matter, where injunctions are ignored, where funding isn't restored, where compliance becomes optional. We are not there. But the danger isn't that rupture is inevitable. It's that the system is rehearsing for it. Every blocked freeze, every reversed cut, every ruling that says no authority, they are safeguards and they are stress tests. Which path emerges depends on something deceptively small. Whether the next escalation is restrained or repeated, because systems don't fail from one shock. They fail from unresolved ones. And the final question isn't what the law allows, it's how many times it has to be enforced. This is not where the story resolves. Because systems like this don't end, they evolve. Right now, the system is teaching itself a new habit. That power can be tested, that limits can be pushed, that courts and Congress will respond, but only after damage. That lesson doesn't disappear when an administration changes. It gets stored, and the next time, the moves come faster, more precise, harder to unwind. So the danger isn't a single president. It's a method that proved workable enough to try again. If you've stayed this far, it's because you understand something important. That neutrality is not self-defending. That laws don't enforce themselves. That systems only hold if people notice when they're being bent. This is the point where most coverage stops. After the ruling, after the block, after the headline. That's too late. Because the real story isn't who lost in court. It's what keeps getting attempted anyway, and that's what we'll be watching next.